Robby, what's on your radar?
Well, here's a question. Is the mainstream media finally ready to start scrutinizing Hunter Biden's scandals? Over the past few days, Hunter's aggressive new legal strategy has finally earned him some attention outside conservative media. That strategy involves demanding criminal probes and threatening defamation lawsuits against people like Rudy Giuliani, Steve Bannon, and even Fox News' Tucker Carlson. Indeed, Tucker is being targeted for merely talking about the infamous New York Post laptop story. Hunter Biden is essentially trying to silence criticism. So here's another question. Isn't that an implicit threat to freedom of the press? And shouldn't the mainstream media be treating it as such? I have to think that if Donald Trump's children threatened to sue media institutions for scrutinizing their financial dealings, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, they'd all strongly condemn it. But Hunter Biden's efforts are mainly being treated as some kind of sideshow, harmless, ineffective even. Now, I raised this point in an interview on Fox News over the weekend. Let's watch.
Nobody likes their press coverage, especially when they're public figures. Donald Trump didn't like his press coverage and used to try to change it. I don't know if he ever threatened lawsuits or not. I think he did, actually.
Well, he sued a few people.
Yeah, he sued a few people.
In fact, he just sued Bob Woodward for $49 million over those audio tapes.
Is that a chilling effect on free speech? I think Donald Trump is a much bigger, more powerful figure than Hunter Biden.
I think it is, but it's been covered in the mainstream is the difference. Whereas where will be the mainstream denunciation of what the Biden family, what Hunter Biden is doing here against freedom of the press? That's the difference.
So you feel like much of the media are, it's interesting. Hunter Biden wants this out, but it's been very little on it on MSNBC, even though he wants this out. So are you feeling like there's still a sort of a protective gloss where many in the press say, well, he's had a lot of problems. He's a drug addict. He's tried to kick it. Yeah, he shouldn't have been, trying to get contracts with the Chinese and in Ukraine when he has no experience in those areas. You don't think this has changed the equation that much?
I think they mostly don't want to cover it because they're embarrassed by the fact that their initial reaction, so many of the people in progressive and mainstream media, was to say that this is a Russian interference thing, suggesting maybe that the laptop didn't exist. And then I'm thinking, so then the repairman, is he an actor? Is it what? It never made any sense to think that the laptop itself, you could think the implications weren't important, but that was planted by Russia. It never made any sense, and they should be embarrassed. Well, I think they are embarrassed. They are embarrassed. The mainstream media doesn't want to criticize Hunter Biden because mainstream operators would need to look inward at themselves, at their own culpability for promoting the idea that the laptop was part of a Russian influence campaign. The idea that everything having to do with Trump and the right ties back to villainous Russian behavior has now been repeatedly debunked, of course. Many alternative and independent media sources suspected it was false from the start, and their suspicions have been bolstered by numerous reports and studies that have chipped away at the dominant narrative. We now know for sure that the so-called Russian influence campaign on social media was minuscule and had practically no reach. In fact, we recently learned that even content moderators at Twitter became aware that the entire idea of influential Russian bots was a hoax. But anti-Russia fervor was so extreme that they didn't dare speak up about it. One individual who has definitely caught on is former New York Times reporter Jeff Gerth. Gerth published a lengthy report for the Columbia Journalism Review in which he examines the coverage of Russiagate from his former paper. Gerth writes that, quote, news outlets and watchdogs haven't been forthright in examining their own Trump-Russia coverage, which includes serious flaws. Now, Gerth reminds readers that New York Times columnist Paul Krugman called Trump a Siberian candidate. The Atlantic's editor-in-chief, Jeffrey Goldberg, said Trump was a de facto agent of Putin, and those comments were just in reaction to Trump slightly tweaking his platform's approach to Ukraine. The platform still called for sanctions on Russia and assistance to Ukraine, just not specifically arms, which was consistent with what the Obama administration had advocated anyway. That was enough for the mainstream media to conclude that Trump was a Manchurian candidate. Jeff Gerth also points out for the Columbia Journalism Review that the public's opinion of the media is at an all-time low, though trust in media has become extremely partisan, with 70% of Democrats trusting the media still, but just 14% of Republicans feeling that way. As my colleague at Reason Magazine, J.D. Tuchile, points out, quote, if more of the journalists pursuing the Russiagate story had been scrupulous about getting the facts right, they might have noticed that a story that many wanted to be true was remarkably thin and ultimately inaccurate. Failing to perform due diligence did the media no favors when the facts finally emerged and further eroded public trust. And I encourage everyone to go read that very long piece for the Columbia Journalism Review about Russiagate and holding the media accountable, which I think continues to be so important. Batya, this is my view on why the media doesn't necessarily want to cover Hunter Biden or talk about it, because it would mean looking at their own mistakes with the entire Russia collusion narrative, but then specifically as well with the New York Post story, in which they all said this was planted by Russia, pay it no mind. And that was a kind of a ludicrous thing, honestly, to even think at the time. But they clung to it for years in some cases.
Yeah, I've recently been feeling like what I want is a word to describe what it feels like when publications that smeared me as, racist or a Putin stooge or this or that for saying something, a year later, 2 years later, 5 years later, when they come around to that view, like, what do I get for having been smeared, for having been right about that in the first place, right? And I think it's so amazing because, of course, the Columbia Journalism Review was at the forefront of woke media for so long, policing narratives around gender and race, around Trump, around Trump's voters, part of that chorus that really created the inability of so many journalists to speak the truth because they knew that it would be a career-ending move. So it's, of course, I'm glad to see it now, but at the same time, like, what about the last 5 years, right? Like, where do we go from here? But yeah, of course, from my point of view, I wrote a whole book about this. There's a huge class component to this, right? The mainstream leftist media is made up of elites from, very highly over-credentialed, highly educated elites who saw in Trump, the rising up of the unwashed masses, right, against their economic interests. And so they sort of had to enforce this narrative that he was, could never have won on his own merits, because that would mean that, the world that they had created, for their economic interests was exactly that, was not some sort of morally superior world. It was just one that served their interests. So I'm glad to see this coming out. And I do have to say, I totally agree that if Trump's kids were behaving the way Hunter Biden is right now, it would be front page news for every publication. At the same time, I do think it's very clear that Joe Biden is no longer taking advice from Hunter Biden. And so the idea that it represents a sort of First Amendment threat, it's sort of like, come on, like, nobody takes this crack addict seriously, but at the same time, the hypocrisy is real, right? So it's a little bit complicated, but I'm so glad that you covered this. A really great radar, Robby.
Thank you. And I think it's just important to remember how, I'm even surprised when I look back at the news coverage from that time period of just how hysterical it was about every single day. There was some new thing to connect Trump to Russia, et cetera. And, with a baseline of, yes, did Putin want to damage Hillary Clinton? Yes. Did they, make some really ham-handed, some really incompetent moves on social media? Yes. Was Paul Manafort corrupt? Yes. That was all true. But from that, they spun this just totally tall tale based in non-truths, things that are not accurate. And that media coverage just still exists. It's out there. It's it's flashback territory, and there's been so little accounting for it. It's really incredible. But we'll have more Rising right after this. Stay with us.